in trespasses and in sin. God called the people to prayer today. Everyone that hears this message, let them feel the need. 21st chapter of 2 Samuel. David spake unto the Lord. Here David is praying. As I said to you a few moments ago, he's seeking God for an answer. He needs an answer. He's got to have an answer. There's been a drought. It hasn't rained for 3 years. And he's saying to the Lord, Lord, why has this judgment fell? God told him it was because of the sins of somebody else. David wanted to make an atonement to the Gibeonites, and they declared that he'd have to give them 7 of the sons of Saul. So he took 5 sons that belonged to Michal and 2 that belonged to another woman named Rizpah, and they slayed them and hung them up in the sun. Here is a woman named Rizpah. Day and night and night and day, she's beating the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field off of 7 corpses. These boys have been slayed to make an atonement for the Gibeonites because of Saul's sins. Now our thought is, Michal had 5 boys, Rizpah had 2. Michal did not help Rizpah. But it was Rizpah who carried the load, who carried the burden, and she loved her own boys, and she loved Michal's boys more than Michal loved her own sons. And I said, where was Michal? Michal was off in the church somewhere, possibly having an afternoon tea, dishing up fried chicken. God hasn't called the church to fried chicken. God's called the church to clean up and pay through and have revival. God's called the church to prayer. God's called the church to work on its knees. Your great reward isn't going to be for the hours you spend on the cook stove in the basement of your church. Your reward is going to be the hours you spend in the upper room, not the supper room. In the upper room on your knees, in the power of the Holy Ghost. Just like Rizpah of old, beating the fowls of the air, which typify demon spirits, beating the beasts of the field, which typify the devil himself that goes about as a roaring lion, seeking your boys and your girls and trying to destroy them. And listen, don't tell me you can't do it. Rizpah day and night and day. She stood there day and night vigil, beating the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field off of those boys who already were dead, which to us is a type of prayer. Every one of us should take up the power of prayer, and if demon spirits like the fowls of the air have fastened themselves or trying to wring the pieces, your son or your daughter, your wife or your husband, you need to take up the power of prayer and beat every one of the evil forces off of your sons, off of your daughters, off of your children. Do you believe you can do it? Hear me. What happened to Michal? Don't you worry. She's going to stand before God one of these days, and she's going to give an account for not helping Rizpah, at least for not taking the day vigil or the night vigil and sharing the load with Rizpah, because she had more boys there than did Rizpah. Is that right? I was telling the story in Oregon a number of years ago in an afternoon service and preaching about the sin of Michal in failing to share the load and the burden with Rizpah and beat the fowls of the air off of these boys, these corpses who were dead. One little woman came up to me after I was through preaching. Tears of joy run down her face, and she grabbed me with her hands and she said, at last, after 14 years, the first ray of light in 14 years is shining into my soul. She said she was preaching straight to me. I asked her what she meant. She said, Brother Allen, I've got a daughter in the Salem State Hospital. And said for 14 long years, she don't even know me when I visit her. And said for 14 long years, she don't even know me when I visit her. And said I visit her once a month, and I take her apples and candy and something nice. And said there's just a far-off look in her eyes. Said it's my own daughter. Said she's not so old. But said now her hair is white. Her face is filled with wrinkles. Said she looks like an old bent woman. Said, Brother Allen, the reason she's there, said the demon spirits have afflicted her and she's insane. Said I didn't know there was any hope for her. Said I had no hope that she'd ever be released or ever get any help until the day you told the story of Rizpah. And you told how she prayed day and night, and she beat all the fowls of the air off of boys that were already dead. And she said while he was preaching, God spoke to me, and God said, that's your daughter. The fowls of the air have afflicted her, and the insane demons have gotten hold of her. But said, as sure as Rizpah beat them off of those boys that were dead, you can beat them off of your daughter, though she be in an insane asylum. And so she said, after all these years, after 14 years, the first ray of light is shining into my soul. And she said, I promise God that I'm going to begin to fast, and I'm going to pray, and in prayer and in fasting, I'm going to beat the insane demons off of my daughter. And it so happened I was scheduled in Salem, Oregon for a campaign leader. She said, while you're in Salem, I'm scheduled to pay the next visit to my daughter. And she said, Brother Allen, will you go with me to that insane institution and visit my daughter with me? I said, I'll do it. Got into Salem a month later, and the next night she was at the church where I was preaching. Met her at the door, and she said, I've got an appointment in the morning to see my daughter. She said, remember me? You promised to go with me. I said, I remember you. She said, Brother Allen, I've been fasting and praying for a month. But she said, a few days ago, the victory came. She said, in my prayer closet, in the power of prayer, in the Spirit, I have been beating the powers of the air and the beasts of the field off of my daughter. And she said, 3 days ago, a marvelous experience came to me. And she said, I know that when I see my daughter today, she's going to be normal. She'd been faithful and hadn't given up. Met her down the next day in the vestibule of that big, long, gray brick building with the walls and the barred windows. Hall after hall we marched through, and nurse after nurse turned us over to new nurses. Big keys rattled on big rings that hung at the side of those white-clad nurses. And finally they turned us over to the last nurse, and she came down to one big gray door. Said, your daughter's in there. But said, you're going to be surprised today, Mother, when you see your daughter. The mother wrung her hands and almost shouted and said, what do you mean? Well, she said, 3 days ago, a change came over your daughter. Said the nurses and the doctors are amazed. Said they're speaking about releasing her. There's nothing wrong with her. Something has happened. It's a miracle of God. And the little woman shouted outside the great door. And the nurse said, I'm not going to take you in. You open the door and go in yourself. Said, I'd like to stand outside the door and watch and see what happens this morning. That little mother turned the doorknob and swung the door open. And I looked over her shoulder, and across the room stood a girl. The mother whispered to me and said, I have the most peculiar feeling. She's going to call me Mother today. That girl turned around, and I saw a woman that had been bent and stooped and gray and wrinkled. But this morning there was a smile on her face, and her eyes were shining. And when she turned around, she saw this woman with me. She put up both hands and said, oh, Mother! Run to that woman, threw her arms around her for the first time in 14 years, knew her own mother. Victory had come. That little woman shouted. She danced all over that insane asylum room, declaring, I knew that God was going to do it. I knew that God was going to do it. She said, Brother Allen, I knew this morning my daughter was going to be delivered. But she said, it took me more than 3 weeks on my knees in my prayer closet to beat the foul, insane devils or the birds of the air off of my daughter. And she said, I'll never forget the sermon you preached, telling me how I could deliver my daughter. And friend, listen, that daughter was released immediately, got her a job in a store downtown, and today she's still free. If that mother hadn't taken up the power of prayer, if she hadn't begun to fast and to pray, that girl would have died in an insane asylum before her time, eaten up and devoured by the birds of the air. Some of you have got a boy. Some of you have got a girl that's bound, tied and fettered, maybe off in an institution or bound by sin. But you have got power. You can take up the club of prayer like Rizpah did. And if you'll be faithful, God will stand by your side, and you can beat in the power of the Spirit in faith. Rebuke the demon spirits that have your son or daughter or husband, wife, or loved one in bondage, and you can shout the victory if you're willing to do what I say. God give us grace this morning to be doers of the word and not hearers only. Let all